Okay, guys, what I'm going to talk to you about today is how and why we breathe. First of all, a couple of things. Number one, the lungs actually kind of float in the thoracic cavity. They're not locked in place, but they actually have a cover around them. So the lungs have this thin, kind of like a saran wrap that covers each lung individually. And the right and left lung have their own saran wrap, and that's referred to as the visceral pleura. Visceral guts. Then the lungs have that line the rib cage and is directly connected to the diaphragm. They have, and again, each lung is separated. That's a good thing. With this thick, tough lining that lines the inside of the rib cage called the parietal pleura. Now, very important that you get this. The parietal pleura is directly connected to this dome-shaped muscle called the diaphragm. And if you recall from chemistry, you talked about the gas laws. And one of the gas laws that you discussed was Boyle's law. And Boyle's law deals with pressure and volume. And Boyle stated that if you increase the volume of your lungs, that will lead to a corresponding decrease in the pressure inside the lungs. So normally you breathe out of 3 holes, 2 nostrils and a mouth. So this is the important piece. When the diaphragm contracts, because it's connected to the parietal pleura, it is going to force the diaphragm downward. And because the parietal pleura is connected to it, it's going to cause the lungs to elongate. Observe. So when the diaphragm is contracted, it's going to make the lungs longer, and that's going to decrease the pressure inside the thoracic cavity. The result is that atmospheric pressure, the pressure of the air, is now greater than the pressure inside the lungs. And as you learned, things always go from high to low. So air will enter the 2 nostrils or the mouth, and you will send oxygen to the smallest part of the airways, which in this case are the capillaries. So that's the basic mechanics of breathing. What I'm going to cover next is why you breathe. So I just explained to you how you breathe. I want to explain to you next why you breathe. All right. What I'd like to do now is explain to you why you breathe. Now, breathing is controlled primarily by your brainstem. And specifically, the part of your brainstem that controls breathing is the medulla oblongata. So the medulla is part of your brainstem that controls basic biological functions. It helps control your heart rate, blood pressure, and helps control breathing. And as you know, because it's part of the brain, it's nervous tissue. And the function of nerves are to send electrical impulses. So the question is, what's the stimulus for breathing? Well, the most powerful stimulus for breathing in the human body is an increase in the waste product of metabolism called carbon dioxide. So as carbon dioxide builds up in arterial blood, that will stimulate the medulla, and the medulla will begin to fire electrical impulses. Now, what's the primary muscle of breathing? That's your diaphragm. So when the medulla detects a buildup of carbon dioxide in your arterial blood, it's going to send an electrical impulse down your spinal cord. And the nerves that are responsible for stimulating the diaphragm to contract and flatten out, they're called the phrenic nerve. Now, the phrenic nerve has two branches. It has a right and left branch. And they will stimulate the diaphragm to contract. So let me give you an example. Say, for example, that you are running. Your muscle cells become more metabolically active, right? So they need to make more ATP. And the result is that you get an increase in the production of carbon dioxide. Now, with this increased production of carbon dioxide, respiration isn't immediately increased. So CO2 will begin to build up in the arterial blood, and that will signal the stimulate the medulla to produce an electrical impulse that will travel down both the right and left branch of the phrenic nerve. And again, when the phrenic nerve stimulates the diaphragm contracts by flattening out. And because the parietal pleura is connected to the diaphragm, it's going to pull the lungs down. And that's going to increase the volume of the lungs. And when you increase the volume of the lungs, you decrease the pressure inside the lungs, and that will allow air to move from the atmosphere, which has higher pressure, into the nostrils or mouth, into the lungs that have lower pressure because you increase your volume. Now, and some of this you remember from anatomy. Now, look, got a little bucket here. So if you look at the way the ribs are arranged, the ribs are not coming straight across. They're kind of displaced downward. And in between the ribs are muscles called intercostal muscles. So in times where you need to get more air into your lungs, you will begin to use the intercostal muscles. And when you use the intercostal muscles, it will contract the rib cage and it will raise it up. And what that does, all you got to do is just take a big deep breath, right now. And you will see that the anterior, posterior diameter of your chest, that's going to increase, therefore increasing the volume of your lungs. So in times where you need to get more air in and more CO2 out, you're going to start using those intercostal muscles. They're referred to as the accessory muscles of ventilation. So the story is that we breathe by changes in pressure, right? You contract the diaphragm. It's connected to parietal pleura. It's going to pull the lungs down, increasing the volume. That's going to create a lower pressure in the lungs and a higher pressure in the atmosphere, so the air is going to go in. And we breathe because of increased carbon dioxide in arterial blood. So that's the story of how and why we breathe.